In the sprawling arena of the Galactic Marksmanship Championship, where the finest shooters from across 1,000 worlds gathered to prove their supremacy, nobody expected the human to survive the first round. They were the new species on the block, barely crawling out of their gravity well for 3 decades. Their primitive kinetic weapons laughably outdated compared to the plasma cannons and quantum disruptors wielded by civilizations that had mastered warfare for millennia. Commander Zexhai of the Valkyrian Empire stood 7 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the arena lights as he sneered at the small human female, adjusting what looked like an antique projectile weapon. His mandibles clicked in amusement as he broadcast on the common frequency for all to hear. Look at this pathetic creature with her primitive metal thrower. I've seen younglings with better equipment in training simulations. Perhaps we should offer her a participation trophy before she embarrasses herself further. The crowd of alien spectators erupted in clicking, chirping, and buzzing laughter. The Visian delegates adjusted their crystalline forms to better focus their optical sensors on what they assumed would be a swift and humiliating defeat. Even the normally stoic Andromedans allowed themselves the equivalent of a smile, their telepathic murmurs rippling through the crowd like waves of condescension. But Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez didn't flinch. She didn't respond to the taunts or acknowledge the mocking laughter echoing through the massive structure that could house a small city. Instead, she simply checked her rifle one final time, felt the familiar weight of her grandfather's scope mounted on a weapon system that had been refined through centuries of human conflict, and waited for the signal that would change everything the galaxy thought they knew about Earth and its children. What happened next will be talked about in military academies, broadcast across 100 worlds, and remembered as the moment when humanity announced to the universe that sometimes the old ways, combined with something uniquely human, could shock even the most advanced civilizations in a stunned silence. The registration hall of Station Omega. 7 buzzed with the controlled chaos of 1,000 different species attempting to complete paperwork in languages that didn't always translate properly. Elena Vasquez stood in line behind a creature that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts of a mantis and a crystal chandelier, trying not to stare as it filled out forms with what appeared to be concentrated light beams from its fingertips. 3 months ago, Elena had been running training exercises at Fort Bragg, pushing new recruits through the fundamentals of marksmanship with the same rifle that had belonged to her grandfather during the Third World War. Now she was representing all of humanity in an intergalactic shooting competition that most people back on Earth didn't even know existed. The invitation had come through official channels, delivered by an alien diplomat whose name Elena couldn't pronounce, and whose species she couldn't identify. The Galactic Council, apparently, had decided that Earth's recent admission to the interstellar community warranted an invitation to their annual championship. It was, the diplomat had explained through a translation device that made him sound like he was speaking through water, both in honor and in expectation. Every civilized species participates, the diplomat had said, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence. It demonstrates military readiness and cultural sophistication. Surely Earth has warriors capable of representing your species adequately. The word adequately had hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena had volunteered before anyone else could speak up. She had been shooting since she was 8 years old, had earned expert marksman badges in 3 different military specialties, and had never met a target she couldn't hit. How hard could it be? Now, standing in this alien registration hall with her standard-issue rifle case slung over her shoulder, Elena was beginning to understand just how naive that question had been. The creature in front of her finished its registration and moved away with movements that defied several laws of physics. Elena stepped up to the counter, where a being that looked like a professional basketball player crossed with a praying mantis looked down at her with obvious skepticism. Species designation, it asked, its voice emerging from a translator box mounted on its thorax. Human, Elena replied, trying to project confidence she wasn't entirely feeling. The clerk's compound eyes shifted as it consulted what appeared to be a floating holographic display. Ah yes, the new species from Sector 7 Alpha. Sol system, third planet. Very primitive technology base. Recently achieved basic interstellar travel. It paused, antennae twitching. Are you certain you wish to register for the Combat Marksmanship Division? We have recreational categories that might be more appropriate for developing species. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm here to compete with the best. Combat Marksmanship Division. The clerk's antennae drooped slightly. The universal gesture Elena was learning meant something like, your funeral. It tapped something on its holographic display with one impossibly thin finger. Very well. You'll need to submit your weapon specifications for review. The judges will need to ensure it meets minimum technological standards. Elena hefted her rifle case onto the counter and opened it, revealing her grandfather's Springfield Model 2087, a weapon that represented the pinnacle of human ballistic technology. To Elena, it was a thing of beauty, machined to tolerances that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. Its scope capable of calculating windage and drop automatically, its action smooth as silk after 3 generations of careful maintenance. The clerk looked at it for a long moment, then consulted its display again. Elena could see reflected holographic text scrolling past, most of it in languages that made her eyes water to look at. This is a kinetic projectile weapon, the clerk said finally, its tone suggesting Elena had just presented a club made from animal bones. Yes, Elena confirmed. Chemical propellant, ballistic trajectory, impact-based damage system. And the energy source for the projectile acceleration? Gunpowder, Elena said, immediately realizing how that must sound in a galaxy where weapons were powered by antimatter and quantum fluctuations. The clerk's eyes went wide. Chemical combustion? You're planning to compete against plasma rifles and disruptor cannons with a weapon powered by chemical combustion. It's very efficient chemical combustion, Elena said weakly. The clerk stared at her for another moment, then began typing rapidly on its holographic interface. Elena could hear clicking sounds that she suspected might be laughter. Weapon registered, the clerk announced. Though I should warn you, the preliminary round has a required accuracy standard of 98% at ranges up to 2 kilometers in variable atmosphere conditions. Most developing species wait until their technology base reaches at least Class 4 before attempting this competition. What class is humanity rated at? Elena asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. According to our records, you've just achieved Class 1 status. Congratulations on discovering faster-than-light travel, by the way. Only took you 12,000 years longer than a galactic average. Elena felt her jaw clench. Thank you. Where do I report for the technical briefing? The clerk gestured toward a doorway marked with symbols that Elena's translation device rendered as something like contestant preparation area. Please leave all dignity at the door. Good luck, the clerk said, and Elena was certain she heard genuine sympathy in its translated voice. Try not to embarrass your species too badly. The technical briefing took place in an amphitheater that could have housed a small city. Elena found herself seated between a creature that looked like it had been carved from living crystal and another that appeared to be made entirely of organized energy held together by what might charitably be called wishful thinking. Neither acknowledged her presence, though she caught them exchanging what were probably meaningful glances over her head. The briefing was conducted by a being that introduced itself as competition director Vortha K, whose species Elena couldn't begin to guess at. It looked like someone had crossed a squid with a geometric proof and given the result military training. Welcome, warriors of the galaxy, Vortha K began, its voice somehow reaching every corner of the enormous space without obvious amplification. You represent the finest marksmen of your respective civilizations, gathered here to compete in the most prestigious test of accuracy and skill known to civilized space. Elena looked around the amphitheater, taking in the incredible diversity of aliens around her. There were beings that looked like they belonged in nightmares, others that seemed too beautiful to exist, and a few that appeared to be mathematical concepts given physical form. All of them looked confident. All of them looked experienced. All of them looked like they belonged here. Elena looked down at her hands, calloused from years of gripping rifle stocks and trigger guards, and wondered what the hell she had gotten herself into. The competition consists of 5 rounds. Vorthake continued. Preliminary accuracy testing, environmental challenge shooting, moving target engagement, extreme range precision, and the final champion challenge. Each round eliminates approximately half of the remaining contestants. Elena did quick math in her head. With over 500 contestants registered, that meant only 30 or so would make it to the final round. She'd need to beat out beings whose civilizations had been refining the art of warfare since before humans had discovered agriculture. Weapons technology is unrestricted, the director announced, though all energy sources must be self-contained within the weapon system itself. No external power supplies, no orbital support, no quantum entanglement with off-site systems. Several contestants around Elena made noises that her translator rendered as disappointment. Apparently, some civilizations had been planning to cheat in ways Elena couldn't even begin to understand. Preliminary round begins in 6 standard hours. You will be assigned shooting positions based on your species' atmospheric requirements. Humans. The director paused, consulting what appeared to be a floating data tablet. Standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, gravity tolerance 1G, visual spectrum roughly 380 to 700 nanometers. You'll be assigned to Environmental Section 7 with other carbon-based oxygen breathers. Elena nodded, making mental notes. At least she wouldn't have to worry about breathing apparatus or gravity adjustment. One final note, Director Vorthake announced. While this is a competition, it is also a demonstration of your species' military capabilities to the greater galactic community. Performance here often influences diplomatic relationships, trade agreements, and mutual defense treaties. Do try not to embarrass yourselves. As the briefing ended and contestants began filing out, Elena overheard conversations in a dozen different languages, most of which her translator struggled with. What it did manage to render wasn't encouraging. The human is competing with a primitive kinetic weapon, one being was saying to another. Their species only achieved interstellar travel 30 standard years ago. Chemical propulsion systems, its companion replied with what sounded like disgust. I've seen museum pieces with better technology. Still, it shows courage, the first being mused. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless. Elena gritted her teeth and shouldered her rifle case. She'd heard variations of this conversation a dozen times already, and they were all starting to sound the same. Primitive, outdated, foolish, embarrassing. She made her way back to her assigned quarters, a small but comfortable room in the section designated for developing civilizations. Even her accommodations were a reminder of where humanity stood in the galactic pecking order. Elena set her rifle case on the narrow bed and opened it, running her hands over the familiar contours of the weapon that had served 3 generations of her family. Her grandfather had carried it through the Amazon campaign, her father had used it in the Afghan conflict, and now she was about to take it into competition against technologies she couldn't even pronounce the names of. The rifle was a work of art, its action hand-fitted by craftsmen who understood that sometimes perfection couldn't be mass-produced. The barrel was forged from an alloy that had taken decades to develop, capable of withstanding pressures and temperatures that would destroy lesser weapons. The scope was a miracle of human engineering, incorporating advances in materials science, computer processing, and optical design that represented the absolute pinnacle of what Earth could produce. But it was still, at its heart, a chemical combustion kinetic projectile weapon. It worked by creating a controlled explosion that hurled a small piece of metal very quickly in a specific direction. Compared to the plasma rifles and quantum disruptors she'd seen other contestants carrying, it might as well have been a crossbow. Elena closed her eyes and tried to channel the confidence she'd felt back on Earth, when volunteering for this competition had seemed like the obvious choice. She was a good shot. Hell, she was a great shot. She'd won competitions against the best marksman Earth could produce. She'd qualified on every weapon system the military had given her, often with scores that made her instructors shake their heads in amazement. But Earth's best might not be good enough here. Not against beings whose civilizations had been perfecting the art of warfare since before humans had learned to make fire. A chime from her room's communication system interrupted her brooding. The device struggled for a moment before producing a rough approximation of English. Attention, contestant Vasquez. You have been assigned to preliminary testing position 342 in Environmental Section 7. Report to designated area in 4 standard hours for equipment verification and atmospheric adjustment. May your aim be true and your ancestors guide your shots. Elena smiled despite herself. Even the automated systems were more polite than most of the aliens she'd encountered so far. For hours. Enough time to clean her rifle, check her ammunition, and maybe grab something that might charitably be called food from the section mess hall. She'd need her strength for whatever the preliminary round had in store. As she began field stripping her rifle with practiced movements that were as much meditation as maintenance, Elena allowed herself one moment of doubt. Maybe she was in over her head. Maybe humanity wasn't ready for this kind of competition. Maybe she should have stayed in her lane and let more advanced species handle this level of interstellar politics. Then, she thought about the clerk's condescending tone, the other contestants dismissing her before she'd even fired a shot, and Director Vorthake's warning about not embarrassing herself. Elena had been underestimated before. She'd grown up the smallest kid in her class, enlisted in a military where women still had to prove themselves twice as hard as men, and earned her stripes in a profession where respect had to be taken, not given. She'd never backed down from a challenge yet, and she wasn't about to start now. Elena finished cleaning her rifle and began loading her magazines with the careful precision that had been drilled into her over years of training. Each round was hand-selected, weighed to the 1/10 of a grain, and seated to exact specifications. If she was going to compete with primitive technology, she was going to make damn sure it was the most perfectly executed primitive technology anyone had ever seen. The galaxy was about to learn something about humans that their databases and diplomatic reports couldn't capture. Sometimes the old ways worked just fine, especially when combined with the kind of stubborn determination that had carried humanity from caves to the stars in the first place. Elena smiled as she closed the action on her rifle and heard the satisfying click of everything falling into perfect alignment. Tomorrow, she was going to show 500 of the galaxy's finest marksmen exactly what a human could do with chemical combustion and a really, really good scope. The preliminary testing facility was a marvel of engineering that stretched across nearly a square kilometer of Station Omega-7 surface. Elena arrived at her assigned position to find herself surrounded by shooting lanes that accommodated every conceivable form of alien physiology, from elevated platforms for the towering Krex High to pools of conducting fluid for the energy-based Luminari. Her own position was mercifully straightforward, a standard shooting bench with adjustable height, comfortable padding, and environmental controls set to Earth normal atmosphere. The targets, however, were anything but standard. Elena peered through her scope at the first target array, located exactly 2 kilometers downrange across what appeared to be a perfectly controlled environment. The targets themselves were barely visible to the naked eye. Circular discs, perhaps 10 centimeters in diameter, marked with scoring rings that would require her scope's maximum magnification to distinguish clearly. "Impressive setup," said a voice beside her. Elena turned to see a humanoid figure settling into the adjacent shooting position. The being stood roughly her height, with blue-tinted skin and large, dark eyes that suggested excellent vision. According to the nameplate on his equipment case, he was Kethvar of the Centauri Republic. "First time competing?" Kethvar asked, his translator rendering his speech with only a slight electronic hum. "That obvious?" Elena replied, checking her rifle 0 against the ranging marks in her scope. "Most veterans know better than to show up with kinetic weapons," Kethvar said, not unkindly. "Don't take this the wrong way, but your species' technology base is, well, let's call it developing." Elena glanced over at Kethvar's weapon, a sleek device that hummed with barely contained energy. "What's yours?" "Plasma rifle, Mark 7. accelerates ionized particles to roughly 12% light speed. No ballistic drop, no wind correction, minimal travel time. He gestured toward Elena's rifle. What's the muzzle velocity on that thing? About 1,000 meters per second, Elena admitted. Kethvar's large eyes widened. That's barely supersonic. How do you account for atmospheric conditions? Wind drift, target movement. Elena smiled and tapped the side of her scope. Math. Before Kethvar could respond, the range control system activated with a harmonic tone that somehow managed to be audible to every species present despite their vastly different hearing ranges. Attention contestants, came Director Vorthek's amplified voice. Preliminary testing will now commence. You have exactly 1 standard hour to engage 50 targets at varying ranges from 500 to 2,000 meters. Scoring is cumulative, with bonus points for consecutive hits. The bottom 50% of scores will be eliminated. Elena felt her heart rate spike slightly, then consciously slowed her breathing as she'd been taught. 50 targets in an hour was aggressive, but manageable. She'd done similar exercises during qualification courses, though never with stakes quite this high. Atmospheric conditions are as follows, the director continued. Wind speed varying from 0 to 15 standard units. Direction shifting every 10 minutes. Temperature differential between firing position and target area approximately 6 degrees. Humidity at 45%. Good luck. Elena checked her scope's environmental sensors and frowned. Wind speed varying up to 15 meters per second with changing directions would require constant adjustment. Her rifle's computer could help calculate corrections, but she'd need to stay alert and adapt quickly. First target array active. 50 disc-shaped targets materialized along the range, appearing at various distances and positions across a field that suddenly seemed vast. Elena acquired the closest target through her scope and was relieved to find it exactly where her range calculations suggested it would be. At 500 meters, wind would be minimal factor, but she needed to work quickly to maintain the pace required for all 50 targets. Elena settled into her shooting position, feeling the rifle's familiar weight against her shoulder. The stock fit perfectly against her cheek, the grip sat exactly right in her hands, and the trigger broke at precisely the weight she'd adjusted it to years ago. Whatever technological disadvantages her weapon might have, at least it felt like home. She squeezed off her first round and watched through the scope as the target disc flashed green, indicating a center hit. Around her, she could hear the distinctive whining of energy weapons and the occasional sharp crack of other kinetic systems, but she blocked out the distractions and focused on her next target. Target 2 was at roughly 800 meters, positioned to the left of the range. Elena adjusted for the increased distance, and the wind reading her scope was providing led the crosshairs slightly to account for drift, and fired. Another green flash. By the time she'd engaged her 10th target, Elena had fallen into the rhythm that had carried her through countless training exercises. Acquire, assess, adjust, fire, confirm hit, move to next target. Her rifle's action cycled smoothly as she worked through the magazine, each shot carefully calculated and precisely executed. She was dimly aware that some of the other contestants had already finished, their energy weapons allowing near-instantaneous target engagement. But Elena also noticed that several positions had gone silent early, their occupants apparently struggling with the longer-range targets. Target 25 was at maximum range, positioned almost at the theoretical limit of her rifle's effective accuracy. Elena took extra time to calculate the ballistic solution, accounting for the 6-degree temperature differential and the wind that had shifted to a quartering tailwind. The target appeared as little more than a dot, even through her scope's maximum magnification. Elena controlled her breathing, let her natural respiratory pause settle, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure that had become second nature over years of practice. The rifle fired, the target flashed green, and Elena allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "Impossible," muttered Kethvar from the adjacent position. Elena glanced over to see him staring at her through what appeared to be electronic binoculars. You just made a precision shot at 2 kilometers with a ballistic trajectory. Lucky shot, Elena replied, though she was already lining up her next target. That was your 15th consecutive hit, Kethvar said. At what point does luck become skill? Elena didn't answer, focusing instead on a cluster of mid-range targets that would allow her to work quickly through the remainder of her magazine. She was ahead of pace, which meant she could take more time with the difficult shots without falling behind the time limit. Target 32 required a significant wind correction as the atmospheric conditions shifted again. Elena adjusted her scope settings and watched the wind flags positioned along the range. The breeze was gusting now, creating turbulence that would affect her bullet's flight path in unpredictable ways. She waited for a lull, fired between gusts, and watched the target flash green. Remarkable, said a new voice. Elena looked up to see that a small crowd of contestants who had already finished were gathering behind her shooting position, watching her work. The speaker was Commander HFY, the Valkyrian she'd heard mocking human capabilities during registration. The primitive still thinks it can compete, HFY announced to the growing crowd, his mandibles clicking in what Elena now recognized as laughter. Watch as it struggles with its ancient chemical propulsion system. How quaint that they still use explosive compounds to accelerate projectiles. Several aliens in the crowd made sounds that Elena's translator rendered as agreement and amusement. She forced herself to ignore them, focusing instead on target 35, a difficult shot positioned at an angle that would require her to account for both distance and lateral displacement. Perhaps we should offer assistance, HFY continued, his voice carrying clearly across the range. Does the human understand that its projectiles are affected by atmospheric conditions? Should someone explain ballistic physics to the primitive? Elena paused in her shooting routine and looked back at the crowd. HFY stood at the center, his exoskeleton gleaming under the range lights, clearly enjoying his role as entertainment director for the group. Several other contestants were recording the spectacle with devices Elena couldn't identify. Is there a problem? Elena asked politely. HFY's compound eyes focused on her. No problem, primitive. Please, continue your amusing demonstration. We're all fascinated to see how long you can maintain this charade of competence. Elena looked at the remaining targets, then at her watch. She had 25 minutes left and 15 targets to go. More than enough time to finish, even if she took her time with each shot. Actually, Elena said, rising from her shooting position, I'm curious about something. What's your score so far, Commander? HFY's mandibles stopped clicking. My score is not your concern, primitive. Just wondering, Elena said, glancing at the scoreboards visible at each shooting position. Looks like you finished with 43 hits out of 50 targets. That's what, 86%. The crowd of aliens went suddenly quiet. Elena could see several of them consulting their own scoring displays, their expressions shifting as they processed what she'd just revealed. And you, Kethvar? Elena continued, looking at her neighbor. Looks like 47 hits. 94%. That's quite good. Kethvar's large eyes blinked slowly. What's your score currently? Elena checked her own display. 34 for 34. So far. The silence that followed was profound. Elena could hear the environmental systems cycling, the distant hum of station machinery, and the soft electronic beeping of range equipment, but not a single alien voice. That's impossible, HFY said finally. You cannot have achieved 100% accuracy at these ranges with primitive kinetic technology. Elena shrugged and returned to her shooting position. Primitive technology, modern training, and a lot of practice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have targets to finish. She settled back into her shooting stance and acquired target 35 through her scope. The watching crowd remained silent as she calculated her firing solution, adjusted for the latest atmospheric readings, and squeezed off her shot. Green flash. Target 36 was positioned at an awkward angle that would require Elena to adjust her position significantly. As she began to shift her shooting setup, She heard Kethvar whisper to the crowd behind them. She's been using manual calculations for every shot. No automated targeting system. No computer-assisted fire control. She's calculating windage and elevation corrections in her head. Impossible, someone replied. Ballistic calculations at these ranges require processing power beyond biological capabilities. Elena smiled as she lined up target 36. If only they knew how many hours she'd spent as a teenager, sitting with her grandfather in field around their farm, learning to read wind and estimate range by eye. How many nights she'd spent studying ballistics tables and memorizing the mathematical relationships between velocity, air density, and projectile drop. How many thousands of rounds she'd fired in practice, learning to feel the tiny variations in trigger pull and sight alignment that could mean the difference between a perfect shot and a near miss. Her grandfather had taught her that good shooting was part science, part art, and part something deeper that could only be learned through practice and patience. The science could be taught to anyone, he'd said. The art took time to develop. But that deeper element, the intuitive understanding that let a shooter become one with their weapon and their target, that was something you either had or you didn't. Elena squeezed off her 36 shot and watched the target flash green. Then 37, 38, 39. With 10 minutes remaining and 11 targets left to engage, Elena was well ahead of pace. The crowd behind her had grown larger, and the commentary had shifted from mocking to analytical to something approaching awe. Observe the consistency of her shooting position, someone was saying. Every shot employs identical setup procedures. Note the breathing pattern, another voice added. She's using respiratory control to minimize movement during trigger pull. The weapon itself appears to be manually operated, a third observer commented. Each shot requires physical manipulation of the action to chamber the next cartridge. How does she maintain accuracy with such primitive feeding systems? Elena tuned out the running commentary and focused on target 45, a long-range shot that would test everything she'd learned about reading atmospheric conditions. The wind had picked up again, and the temperature differential was creating small thermal currents that would affect bullet flight in subtle but important ways. She studied the wind flags, watched the heat shimmer rising from the target area, and felt the breeze against her cheek. Her scope's computer was providing data, but Elena had learned long ago to trust her instincts as much as her instruments. There was something in the way the air felt that suggested the wind was about to shift. Elena waited, her rifle ready but not yet aimed. She could feel the attention of the crowd, the weight of their expectations and doubts. But she also felt the familiar calm that came with absolute focus, the zen-like state where everything except the shot seemed to fade away. The wind flags shifted slightly, indicating the change she'd been waiting for. Elena smoothly brought her rifle to bear, acquired the target, made her final adjustments, and fired without hesitation. Green flash. Extraordinary, Kethvar said quietly. She predicted the wind change. 5 targets remaining, 8 minutes on the clock. Elena was no longer shooting quickly. She was shooting perfectly, taking the time to ensure every shot met the standard she'd set for herself. Each target flashed green in turn as she worked through the final sequence with methodical precision. Target 50 was positioned at maximum range, in a location that required both elevation and windage corrections at the limits of what her rifle could deliver. Elena took a full minute to study the conditions, calculate her firing solution, and prepare for the shot. The crowd behind her had gone completely silent, and even the other shooters who were still working had paused to watch. Elena settled into her final shooting position and acquired the distant target through her scope. At 2 kilometers, it appeared as barely more than a speck, even with maximum magnification. The crosshairs danced slightly in the thermal currents, requiring her to time her shot for the moment when atmospheric conditions aligned perfectly with her calculations. She controlled her breathing, let her heart rate settle, and felt the familiar sensation of the world narrowing to just her rifle, and the target. Everything else faded away, The watching crowd, the alien technology surrounding her, the weight of representing her entire species. There was only the shot. Elena squeezed the trigger with the smooth, steady pressure that had become automatic after years of practice. The rifle fired, the bullet flew true across 2 kilometers of space, and the final target flashed brilliant green. The silence that followed was absolute and lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then, the range control system announced in its neutral tone, "Contestant Vasquez, score 50 of 50 targets engaged, 100% accuracy achieved. Congratulations on advancing to round 2. Slowly, the crowd behind Elena began to murmur. She could hear fragments of conversation in dozens of languages, most of which her translator couldn't process quickly enough to render clearly. But the tone was unmistakable: shock, confusion, and grudging respect. Elena stood up from her shooting position and began field stripping her rifle for cleaning, just as she'd been taught. The barrel was hot from the rapid firing, and the action needed attention before the next round. Routine maintenance was as important as good shooting, her grandfather had always said. "How did you do that?" Kethvar asked quietly. Elena looked up from her cleaning routine. "Practice. Lots and lots of practice. But the calculations, the atmospheric corrections, the precision required. Math," Elena said again, smiling. "Really good math, learned from really good teachers, applied with a really good rifle." Commander Zexhai approached her position, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been curiosity. "Your weapon," he said, "it is truly powered only by chemical combustion." "Gunpowder and determination," Elena confirmed. "It's an old combination, but it works." Zexhai's mandibles clicked slowly as he processed this information. "Perhaps," he said finally, "I have underestimated the capabilities of your species." Elena finished cleaning her rifle and began packing it away in its case. "Commander, you haven't seen anything yet." As she closed the case and prepared to leave the range, Elena noticed that the crowd was still watching her. Some were taking notes on devices she couldn't identify. Others appeared to be recording everything she'd done. A few were engaged in what looked like heated discussions about what they just witnessed. The preliminary round had been designed to eliminate half the contestants, to separate the competent from the exceptional. Elena had just demonstrated that sometimes the most primitive technology in the right hands could outperform the most advanced systems the galaxy had to offer. But she also knew this was just the beginning. The preliminary round had been about basic accuracy under controlled conditions. The next round would introduce variables that would test not just her shooting skills, but her ability to adapt to challenges that Earth's military training had never imagined. Elena shouldered her rifle case and headed for the exit, already thinking about what modifications she might need to make to her equipment and techniques. The galaxy had just learned that humanity shouldn't be underestimated. Now she needed to prove that lesson hadn't been a fluke. The environmental challenge range was a technological marvel that made the preliminary facility look like a backyard shooting gallery. Elena stood at the entrance to what could only be described as a pocket dimension, watching as massive holographic displays showed real-time environmental data from a dozen different simulated worlds simultaneously. Each contestant will face firing challenges adapted to conditions found on their home world. Director Vorthike explained to the remaining 250 competitors. This ensures fairness while testing your ability to perform under the environmental stresses your species evolved to handle. Elena studied the holographic Earth that hung in the air before her assigned station. It wasn't the comfortable, climate-controlled Earth of training ranges, but a world of extremes. Arctic winds howling across frozen tundra, desert heat shimmer that made targets dance like mirages, and tropical humidity thick enough to swim through. Your scenario has been selected based on environments where human military forces have historically operated, the director continued, consulting what appeared to be a data tablet that existed primarily as organized light. You will face 5 shooting problems, each in a different terrestrial environment. Completion time is unlimited, but accuracy standards have been raised to 99%. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic simulation. She could see through the environmental barrier. 99% accuracy meant she could afford exactly one miss across all 5 challenges. With targets that would undoubtedly be smaller, farther away, and harder to hit than the preliminary round, this would push her skills to their absolute limits. Additionally, director Vorthike announced, environmental factors will be genuine physical conditions, not simulation. The atmospheric processors will create actual weather patterns, temperature variations, and atmospheric compositions. Protective gear is permitted but may not include targeting assistance or environmental compensation systems. Elena looked around at her fellow remaining contestants. Many were wearing environmental suits that clearly included sophisticated targeting assistance, heads-up displays, automatic range-finding, computer-assisted fire control systems. Her own gear consisted of a winter parka, desert camouflage utilities, and a waterproof cover for her rifle scope. Kethvar was 3 stations down, his sleek plasma rifle now mounted with additional equipment Elena couldn't identify. When he noticed her looking, he gestured toward her basic kit with what she'd learned was his species' equivalent of a concerned expression. "Is that all the environmental gear your species possesses?" he called out. Elena patted her rifle case. "We've learned to adapt. But the atmospheric pressure changes, the temperature variations, the humidity effects on targeting." Kethvar trailed off as Elena shrugged. "Like I said, we adapt." What Elena didn't mention was that human soldiers have been fighting in extreme environments for millennia, long before environmental suits and atmospheric processors existed. She'd trained in conditions that range from Arctic survival exercises to desert warfare simulations, learning to shoot accurately when her hands were numb with cold or when heat mirages made target identification nearly impossible. Her grandfather's stories came back to her as she checked her equipment one final time. Tales of snipers in World War II making impossible shots in Russian winters. Korean War marksmen engaging targets across rice paddies in monsoon rains. And Vietnam-era soldiers learning to shoot through jungle humidity thick enough to deflect bullets. First challenge commencing, the director announced. Arctic combat scenario. Temperature minus 40 degrees standard. Wind gusting to 25 units. Visibility variable due to blowing snow. Elena stepped through the environmental barrier and immediately felt the familiar bite of extreme cold. Her breath formed instant clouds that could obscure her scope if she wasn't careful, and the wind carried snow crystals that stung any exposed skin. She'd experienced worse during winter training in Alaska, but not while trying to shoot at targets that would demand absolute precision. The range before her stretched across what appeared to be genuine Arctic terrain, complete with snow drifts, ice formations, and the kind of wind that seemed to find every gap in her clothing. 5 targets appeared at various distances, barely visible against the white background except for the small dark circles that marked the scoring zones. Elena found a shooting position behind a snow bank that provided some wind protection and set up her rifle with practice movements. The extreme cold would affect her rifle's performance. Metals contracted, lubricants thickened, and ballistic characteristics changed in ways that required careful compensation. She checked her scope's environmental readings and frowned. The temperature was affecting her scope's electronics, causing slight fluctuations in the range-finding calculations. She'd need to rely more heavily on her own estimates and experience than she'd planned. The first target was positioned at roughly 800 meters across a valley filled with swirling snow. Elena studied the wind patterns, watching how the snow moved across different parts of the range. Wind this cold was denser than normal air, which would affect her bullet's flight path differently than standard conditions. She adjusted her calculations, took aim through a momentary break in the snow, and fired. Even through the storm, she could see the target flash green. 1 down, 4 to go. Target 2 was closer, but positioned on an elevated ridge where the wind would create unpredictable turbulence. Elena waited for the gusting to settle, found her firing solution, and squeezed off her second round. Green flash. "Remarkable," came Kethvar's voice over the communication system. Elena glanced over to see him struggling with environmental gear that appeared to be malfunctioning in the extreme cold. How are you compensating for the atmospheric density changes? Elena keyed her communicator while searching for her third target. Experience. What she didn't explain was that she'd learned to shoot in conditions like this during winter warfare training, where electronic systems regularly failed, and soldiers had to rely on fundamental skills that couldn't freeze or malfunction. Her grandfather had taught her to read wind by feel, estimate range by eye, and calculate ballistic solutions in her head using principles that worked regardless of what technology was or wasn't functioning. Target 3 was at maximum range, barely visible through the blowing snow. Elena took extra time to study the conditions, waiting for a brief lull in the storm that would give her a clear line of sight. When a moment came, she was ready. Green flash. Targets 4 and 5 were positioned to test her ability to engage multiple threats quickly while maintaining accuracy in deteriorating conditions. The snow was getting heavier, visibility was dropping, and the cold was beginning to affect even Elena's well-practiced shooting routine. She engaged both targets in rapid succession, working the bolt of her rifle smoothly despite the cold that was making her hands stiff inside her gloves. 2 green flashes confirmed her hits, and the Arctic environment began to fade as the atmosphere processors reconfigured for the next challenge. Challenge 1 completed, the range control system announced. Accuracy, 100%. Transitioning to desert combat scenario. The change was dramatic and immediate. Arctic cold gave way to blazing heat. Swirling snow became shimmering air, and the familiar bite of winter wind was replaced by the dry furnace blast of desert conditions. Elena quickly shed her winter gear and adjusted to the new environment. Desert shooting presented different challenges: heat mirage that made targets appear to dance, thermal currents that could deflect bullets unpredictably, and glare that could wash out scope optics if you weren't careful about positioning. Elena found a firing position that took advantage of available shade and studied the range before her. 5 targets were positioned across terrain that looked like it had been lifted directly from Afghanistan or Iraq, complete with rocky outcroppings, sand dunes, and the kind of heat shimmer that could make accurate range estimation nearly impossible. She trained for this too. Desert warfare courses had taught her to read heat mirage patterns, use thermal currents to her advantage, and compensate for the ballistic effects of hot, thin air. The key was patience, waiting for the brief moments when atmospheric conditions aligned to provide clear shots. Target 1 appeared through her scope as a wavering image distorted by rising heat. Elena waited for the thermal currents to settle, calculated her firing solution based on the modified ballistic characteristics of hot air, and fired. Green flash. The remaining targets fell in sequence as Elena applied lessons learned during deployments to some of the hottest places on Earth. She used the natural rhythm of thermal currents, timed her shots for moments of atmospheric stability, and adjusted her calculations for the reduced air density that would let her bullets fly faster and flatter than normal. Challenge 2 completed. Accuracy, 100%. Transitioning to tropical environment scenario. The heat remained but gained humidity thick enough to feel oppressive. Elena found herself in what appeared to be a Southeast Asian jungle, complete with the kind of moisture-laden air that could make rifle barrels rust overnight and turn ammunition unreliable if you weren't careful. Tropical shooting meant dealing with humidity that could affect both human performance and equipment function. Scopes fogged, metal components corroded, and the heavy air could actually slow bullets enough to require ballistic compensation. But Elena had trained in conditions like this during exercises in Panama and the Philippines, learned to maintain equipment and accuracy in environments that seemed designed to make both impossible. She engaged the 5 tropical targets with the same methodical precision she'd shown in the previous challenges, compensating for humidity effects and using jungle skills learned during training exercises that emphasized adaptation over technology. Challenge 3 completed. Accuracy, 100%. Transitioning to high-altitude scenario. The thin air of high altitude presented its own unique challenges. Elena found herself on what appeared to be a Himalayan peak, shooting across valleys where the reduced air density would let her bullets fly farther and faster than sea level conditions, but where hypoxia could affect her mental calculations and physical steadiness. She controlled her breathing carefully, both to manage the thin air and maintain her shooting rhythm. High-altitude shooting required different ballistic calculations, but Elena had trained for this during mountain warfare exercises, learning to compensate for reduced air resistance and the effects of altitude on both human performance and equipment function. 5 more targets, 5 more green flashes, each one precisely calculated for the unique conditions of high-altitude combat. Challenge for completed. Accuracy, 100%. Transitioning to urban combat scenario. The final environment was perhaps the most complex, a simulated urban setting with the environmental stresses Elena hadn't expected. Heat radiating from concrete and asphalt, air currents created by building configurations, and the kind of atmospheric pollution that could affect long-range ballistics in subtle but important ways. Urban shooting was as much about reading the environment as it was about marksmanship. Heat rising from pavement created thermal currents. Building configurations channeled wind in unpredictable patterns, and the electromagnetic environment could interfere with electronic systems. Elena engaged the 5 urban targets using principles learned during training in simulated city environments, where soldiers had to adapt to conditions that combined the worst aspects of multiple environments while adding new variables unique to human-built landscapes. Challenge 5 completed. Accuracy, 100%. Environmental challenges completed successfully. As the urban environment faded back to the neutral range configuration, Elena became aware that she'd attracted an audience again. Contestants who had finished their own challenges were gathered around monitoring stations, watching her performance data on holographic displays she couldn't see from her position. The conversation she could overhear was markedly different from the mocking commentary of the preliminary round. Perfect accuracy across 5 different environmental scenarios, someone was saying in tones of professional respect. Did you observe her equipment adaptation procedures? Another voice asked. Minimal technological assistance. Maximum use of natural environmental features. The calculations required for those atmospheric compensations. A third voice trailed off in what Elena's translator rendered as amazement. Elena packed her rifle away with the same careful attention to detail she'd shown throughout the challenges. Each environmental scenario had tested different aspects of shooting skill, but more than that, they'd tested her ability to adapt human military training to conditions that most alien civilizations would handle with technological solutions. Kethvar approached as she finished her post-shooting equipment check. His sophisticated environmental gear had apparently malfunctioned during the tropical challenge, leaving him with a score that, while respectable, fell short of the advancement standard. How do you do it? He asked quietly. My species has been developing atmospheric compensation technology for centuries. We have environmental suits that can adapt to any planetary conditions, targeting systems that automatically adjust for atmospheric variables, and computational systems that can calculate ballistic solutions in real time. But you just adapt. Elena shouldered her rifle case. Humans have been fighting in hostile environments since before we invented writing. We learned to adapt because we didn't have any choice. Technology is useful, but it's not a substitute for understanding the fundamentals. But surely your species uses environmental compensation systems during military operations? Elena smiled. Sometimes, but we also train to fight when those systems fail, or when they're not available, or when conditions are so extreme that technology isn't reliable. It's called redundancy. Always have a backup plan that doesn't depend on anything that can break. Director Vorthe K approached with what Elena had learned to recognize as the alien equivalent of professional interest. Contestant Vasquez, your performance data is unusual. Our atmospheric modeling systems show environmental conditions that should have degraded accuracy significantly, yet you maintain perfect performance across all scenarios. Just good training, Director. Indeed. However, I should inform you that the next round will present challenges that may not align as well with your species' evolutionary adaptations. The moving target engagement round will test reaction speed and tracking accuracy at levels that approach the physical limits of most species' neural processing capabilities. Elena felt a familiar surge of competitive determination. I understand, Director. When do we start? As Director Vorthake moved on to brief other contestants, Elena reflected on what she'd just accomplished. The environmental challenges had been designed to test each species' ability to perform under the conditions they'd evolved to handle. But humans hadn't evolved for any single environment. They'd evolved to adapt to whatever environment they found themselves in. That adaptability, combined with military training that emphasized fundamental skills over technological dependence, had allowed her to excel in challenges that were testing other contestants to their limits. But she knew the director was right. The next round would test capabilities that had less to do with environmental adaptation and more to do with raw speed and accuracy. Elena smiled as she headed toward the exit, already planning how she'd approach the next challenge. She'd made it this far by combining human military training with equipment that most aliens considered primitive. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the old ways, refined by centuries of practical application, could compete with the most advanced technology the stars had to offer. But first, she needed to clean her rifle again. In Elena's experience, good equipment maintenance was the foundation of everything else, and she wasn't about to change her procedures now. The moving target engagement facility was a three-dimensional maze of platforms, obstacles, and flight paths that stretched through a volume of space large enough to house a small fleet. Elena stood on her assigned firing platform, watching holographic displays show target trajectories that twisted and curved through impossible angles at speeds that made her eyes water just trying to follow them. This round tests your ability to engage targets exhibiting realistic combat movement patterns, Director Vorthake announced to the remaining 125 contestants. Targets will move at velocities and acceleration rates consistent with actual spacecraft, aircraft, and ground vehicles from across the galaxy. Elena studied the trajectory displays with growing concern. The slowest targets were moving at speeds that would challenge even the most advanced human fighter aircraft. The fastest were exhibiting acceleration patterns that would turn any human pilot into paste against their cockpit walls. Each contestant will engage 25 targets across 5 different movement categories, the director continued. Minimum accuracy requirement is 95%. Target presentation time varies from 10 seconds to 30 seconds, depending on trajectory complexity. Elena did quick math in her head. 25 targets at 95% accuracy meant she could afford exactly one miss. And those targets would be moving at speeds that her chemical propulsion rifle would have significant difficulty intercepting, even if she could calculate the lead angles correctly. She looked around at the other contestants and noticed something that hadn't been apparent during the previous rounds. Many of them were no longer using conventional weapons at all. Instead, they carried devices that looked more like compact computers than rifles. Targeting systems that could apparently engage multiple targets simultaneously with what appeared to be guided projectiles or energy beams that could change direction mid-flight. The human still persists with her primitive kinetic system, Commander Zexhai announced loudly enough for nearby contestants to hear. Perhaps someone should explain that targets moving at 15,000 units per second cannot be engaged with unguided projectiles. Elena looked at the velocity specifications displayed on her targeting screen and felt her stomach sink. 15,000 meters per second was roughly 3% of light speed. Even if she could predict exactly where such a target would be when her bullet arrived, the flight time would be nearly 2 seconds at maximum range. A target moving that fast could change direction multiple times during her bullet's flight. Actually, said a new voice, the human's performance thus far suggests she may surprise us again. Elena turned to see a being she hadn't encountered before. Tall, graceful, with features that seemed to shift slightly, depending on the viewing angle. According to the nameplate on its equipment case, this was High Marksman Veltar of the Ethereal Collective, and its weapon appeared to be constructed from crystallized light held together by principles Elena couldn't begin to understand. The Ethereals have been observing human military doctrine since your species achieved interstellar travel, Veltar continued, addressing Elena directly. Your approach to warfare emphasizes adaptability over technological superiority. It is intriguing. You've been studying us? Elena asked. The collective studies all emerging civilizations. Most develop advanced technology first, then learn to apply it tactically. Humans appear to have developed tactical thinking first, then adapted technology to support existing doctrines. It is unusual. Before Elena could respond, the range control system activated with a harmonic tone that somehow conveyed urgency despite its electronic nature. First movement category, linear high-speed targets. Target velocity 10,000 units per second, constant bearing, range varying from 1 to 4 kilometers. Elena watched through her scope as the first target materialized at maximum range, appearing as little more than a streak of light moving across the star field backdrop. Even at 10 kilometers per second, roughly twice the speed of her fastest bullets, this target was following a predictable linear path. If she could calculate the intercept correctly, she might have a chance. She tracked the target through her scope, calculating lead angles in her head, while her rifle's computer provided range and velocity data. The mathematics were complex, but not impossible. She'd done similar calculations during anti-aircraft training, though never with targets quite this fast. Elena led the target by what her calculations suggested was the correct amount, fired, and watched as her bullet and the target converged at precisely the right point in space. The target flashed green and disappeared. Impossible, she heard Zexai mutter. The computational requirements for that intercept calculation exceed biological processing capabilities. Elena was already tracking the second target, which appeared to be moving even faster along a slightly curved trajectory. This required not just intercept calculations, but also predicting how the target's path would change during her bullet's flight time. She trained for this too, during exercises with drone aircraft that simulated enemy fighters. The key was understanding that you weren't shooting at where the target was, or even where it was going, but where it would be when everything converged in space and time. Second target engaged, green flash confirmed. Third target appeared, moving in a sinusoidal pattern that required Elena to predict not just speed and direction, but also the target's position within its oscillation cycle. Observe her targeting methodology, Veltar was saying to the growing crowd of spectators. She's not using automated fire control systems. Those calculations are being performed organically. Elena tuned out the commentary and focused on the increasingly complex targets. Each one required different mathematical approaches. Some followed ballistic trajectories that could be predicted using physics. Others moved in patterns that seemed designed to defeat conventional targeting systems. Target 8 was moving in a spiral pattern that changed radius unpredictably. Elena watched it through several cycles, identified the mathematical relationship governing the changes, and fired at the point where her calculations indicated the spiral would intersect with her bullet's trajectory. Green flash. The computational complexity she's handling, someone was saying in tones of academic fascination. Without artificial assistance, another voice added, the processing power required should exceed organic neural capabilities. Elena smiled grimly as she tracked Target 9. If only they knew how many hours she'd spent as a teenager, sitting with her grandfather in field around their farm, learning to lead flying birds with an old bolt-action rifle that predated computer assistance by decades. How many clay pigeons she'd shattered while learning to calculate lead angles instinctively. How many hours of training had gone into developing the kind of hand-eye coordination that let her track and engage targets moving faster than anything in Earth's atmosphere. Target 10 was moving in what appeared to be a completely random pattern, changing direction at intervals that defied prediction. Elena studied it through 2 cycles, then realized the pattern wasn't random at all. It was following a mathematical sequence that repeated every 12 seconds. She waited for the beginning of the next cycle, calculated where the target would be at the optimal intercept point, and fired. Green flash. Category 1 completed. The range control system announced. Accuracy, 100%. Proceeding to Category 2. Evasive maneuvering targets. The second category introduced targets that seemed to react to being targeted, changing direction the moment Elena's scope locked onto them. These required a different approach. Instead of calculating intercepts, she needed to predict how the targets would react to her targeting attempts. It was like a chess game played at impossible speeds, with Elena trying to outthink artificial intelligences that had been programmed to defeat conventional targeting systems. But they hadn't been programmed to defeat a human marksman who had learned to think like her targets. Elena began using techniques her grandfather had taught her for hunting game that had learned to avoid human hunters. Instead of targeting directly, she aimed for where the targets would go when they tried to evade her shots. It required understanding not just mathematics, but psychology, predicting how an artificial intelligence would respond to perceived threats. 5 targets engaged, 5 green flashes confirmed. The crowd of spectators had grown larger and quieter, their commentary shifting from skeptical to analytical to something approaching reverence. Category 3. High acceleration targets. These targets moved with acceleration rates that should have been physically impossible, changing velocity from 0 to maximum speed in fractions of a second. Elena realized she wasn't dealing with conventional physics anymore. These targets were using technology that allowed them to ignore momentum and inertia. But even impossible acceleration patterns followed rules, and rules could be understood and predicted. Elena spent precious seconds studying the acceleration patterns, identifying the mathematical relationships that govern them, then began engaging targets based on her understanding of their movement algorithms rather than conventional ballistics. Target 18 required her to fire at empty space, predicting that the target would teleport to that location based on the pattern she'd identified. When it materialized exactly where she'd expected and her bullet was waiting for it, the green flash seemed almost anticlimactic. Category 4. Multidimensional movement patterns. Elena stared through her scope at targets that appeared to be moving through dimensions she couldn't see, appearing and disappearing from normal space in ways that made tracking them nearly impossible. But even interdimensional movement followed patterns, and patterns could be learned. She began treating the targets like quantum phenomena, using probability mathematics instead of deterministic calculations. If a target had a 70% chance of appearing at location A and a 30% chance of appearing at location B, she could fire at location A and maintain her required accuracy rate. It was the most complex shooting Elena had ever attempted, requiring her to combine everything she'd learned about mathematics, physics, and tactical thinking into split-second decisions that had to be correct on the first try. Category 5. Adaptive intelligence targets. The final category introduced targets that learned from her previous shots, adapting their movement patterns to defeat whatever techniques had worked before. Elena found herself in a dynamic battle of wits against artificial intelligences that were analyzing her shooting patterns in real time and modifying their behavior accordingly. This was beyond anything she trained for, but it was also the kind of challenge that human military thinking was designed to handle. When faced with adaptive enemies, the solution wasn't better technology, it was unpredictability. Elena began varying her tactics randomly, using different mathematical approaches for similar targets, sometimes firing early in a target's movement cycle and sometimes waiting until the last possible moment. She made her own behavior as unpredictable as possible, denying the adaptive AIs the patterns they needed to defeat her. The final target was the most challenging yet, an AI that had analyzed all of her previous shots and was actively trying to defeat her specific shooting style. Elena studied it through her scope, watching as it moved in patterns designed specifically to exploit what it thought were her weaknesses. Then, she smiled and did something no military algorithm would expect. She aimed at the target's current position instead of trying to lead it, firing when logic suggested she couldn't possibly hit. The target, having calculated that Elena would never do anything so tactically unsound, had already begun its next evasive maneuver when her bullet arrived at exactly the right place and time. Green flash. Moving target engagement round completed, the range control system announced. Accuracy, 100%. Advancement to final round confirmed. The silence that followed was profound and lasted for what felt like an eternity. Elena became aware that the entire facility had gone quiet, with conversations stopping at shooting positions throughout the massive space. Director Vorthake approached with what Elena was learning to recognize as the alien equivalent of professional amazement. Contestant Vasquez, your performance parameters are beyond our modeling capabilities. Our systems indicate computational requirements that should exceed organic neural processing limits. Elena finished checking her rifle's action and looked up at the director. Humans have been out shooting our calculators for longer than we've had calculators. But the mathematical complexity of those intercept solutions gets easier with practice, Elena said, beginning her post-round maintenance routine. Also, my grandfather taught me to hunt birds when I was 8 years old. After 40,000 clay pigeons, you develop pretty good instincts for leading targets. Veltar stepped forward, its crystalline weapon shifting through colors Elena had no names for. The collective's analysis indicates that human neural architecture may be uniquely suited for the type of parallel processing required for these calculations. Most species develop technology to handle computational complexity. Humans appear to have evolved the ability to handle it organically. Elena considered this as she cleaned her rifle. Maybe we just got really good at math because we needed to hit what we were shooting at, and math was the only tool we had. Commander Zexhai approached, his earlier mockery replaced by what might have been respect. I owe you an apology, human. I underestimated both your capabilities and your species' approach to warfare. No apology necessary, Elena replied. But you might want to remember this when you're updating your intelligence estimates about Earth's military capabilities. As Elena finished her equipment maintenance and prepared to leave the range, she reflected on what she'd just accomplished. The moving target round had pushed her skills to their absolute limits, requiring her to combine mathematical calculation, tactical thinking, and intuitive understanding in ways that even her most challenging training had never demanded. But she'd also proven something important, both to herself and to the watching galaxy. Human military effectiveness didn't depend solely on technological superiority. Sometimes the combination of good training, solid fundamentals, and the kind of adaptive thinking that came from centuries of making do with whatever was available could compete with the most advanced technology the galaxy had to offer. The final round would be different, Elena knew. She'd made it this far by outthinking sophisticated targeting systems and outcomputing advanced artificial intelligences. But the champion challenge would test something more fundamental, the ability to perform under pressure when everything was on the line, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. Elena smiled as she headed toward the exit, her rifle case secure over her shoulder. Whatever the final challenge held, she was ready for it. The galaxy had underestimated humanity's military capabilities, but more than that, they'd underestimated the human capacity to adapt, learn, and excel even when facing challenges that seemed impossible. Tomorrow, she'd find out if that adaptability would be enough to win a championship that some of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been competing for centuries to claim. But first, she needed to get some rest. In Elena's experience, a good night's sleep was often the difference between good shooting and great shooting, and tomorrow she was planning to do some very great shooting indeed. The Champions Arena was unlike anything Elena had experienced in the previous rounds. Instead of a conventional range, She found herself standing on a platform suspended in what appeared to be open space, with holographic displays showing target zones scattered across a volume of void that stretched beyond visual limits. 32 contestants remained from the original 500, representing the finest marksmen from across a galaxy of civilizations. The Champion Challenge tests not only marksmanship, but judgment, adaptability, and performance under absolute pressure. Director Vorthike announced, his voice somehow reaching every contestant despite the apparent vacuum surrounding them. You will face scenarios designed by the greatest military tacticians from across the galaxy, each one a unique test of capabilities that cannot be anticipated or prepared for. Elena looked around at her fellow finalists and realized how far she'd come. These weren't just good shooters. They were representatives of species that had dominated galactic warfare for millennia, carrying weapons that incorporated technologies Earth hadn't even theorized yet. Several contestants wore environmental suits that appeared to be more computer than clothing, while others seemed to exist primarily as energy patterns controlling sophisticated targeting systems. The challenge consists of 3 phases, the director continued. Individual excellence, adaptive problem-solving, and final elimination. Each phase will test different aspects of martial capability. Failure in any phase results in immediate elimination. Elena checked her rifle one final time, running through the maintenance routine that had become as natural as breathing. Her grandfather's Springfield looked primitive among the crystalline energy projectors and quantum targeting systems surrounding her, but it had carried her this far. She'd modified it slightly for the final round, adding a bipod for stability during extended shooting sequences and installing a secondary scope with different magnification characteristics for varied range requirements. Phase 1 begins now. Individual Excellence Challenge. The arena around Elena shifted, reality reshaping itself into what appeared to be a 3-dimensional maze of obstacles, platforms, and targets that stretched in every direction. But these weren't the stationary targets of the preliminary round or even the high-speed moving targets of the previous challenge. These targets were actively trying to kill her. Elena dove behind cover as energy beams sliced through the space where she'd been standing. The targets weren't just moving, they were armed, shooting back with weapons that could actually damage contestants. This wasn't a test of marksmanship anymore. It was a simulated combat environment where mistakes would result in real elimination. She studied the tactical situation from behind a barrier that appeared to be made from crystallized space-time. 20 targets were positioned throughout the maze, each one equipped with weapons and defensive systems that matched her own threat level. But they were also programmed with the combat doctrines of actual galactic civilizations, which meant they would fight using tactics that had proven effective against conventional weapons. Elena smiled grimly. Fortunately, her weapon wasn't conventional by galactic standards. The first target was positioned on an elevated platform roughly 400 meters away, using an energy shield that deflected most incoming fire while returning targeted bursts of plasma. Elena studied its firing pattern, identified the brief windows when the shield recycled, and fired a single shot through a gap that existed for less than half a second. The target exploded in a shower of sparks. Contestant Vasquez has engaged Target Alpha when the arena's commentary system announced. Elimination achieved through shield penetration during defensive cycle gap. Analysis indicates projectile velocity insufficient to penetrate active shielding, but timing precision allowed exploitation of system vulnerability. Elena was already moving to her next position, using cover and concealment techniques that predated galactic civilization. The second target was protected by active countermeasures designed to intercept incoming energy weapons, but Elena's kinetic projectiles were moving too slowly to trigger the defensive systems. Another perfectly timed shot eliminated the target before it could adapt. Around the arena, she could hear other contestants engaging their own targets with weapons that sounded like controlled lightning and directed thunder. Energy signatures blazed across her peripheral vision as advanced targeting systems engaged threats with computational precision that exceeded anything human technology could produce. But Elena was using different tactics entirely. Instead of relying on overwhelming firepower or technological superiority, she was using stealth, patience, and precision shooting techniques that treated each target as an individual puzzle to be solved rather than an enemy to be overwhelmed. Target 7 was equipped with sensors that could track energy signatures, but had difficulty detecting purely kinetic weapons. Elena used this blind spot to approach within optimal range, then eliminated it with a shot that passed through its sensory field without triggering any defensive responses. Remarkable tactical adaptation. She heard Veltar commenting over the communication system. The human is exploiting technological gaps rather than engaging in direct confrontation. Target 12 required Elena to make a shot through a gap in its armor that was only visible from one specific angle for brief intervals as it rotated through its defensive cycle. She waited in position for 8 minutes, timing the rotation pattern, then fired at the exact moment when angle, timing, and opportunity aligned. The target's destruction confirmed her patience had been rewarded. By the time Elena eliminated her 20th and final target, she realized that several other contestants had already finished their challenges. But completion time wasn't the primary scoring criterion. Tactical effectiveness and resource efficiency were weighted more heavily than raw speed. Phase 1 completed by all remaining contestants. Director Vorthake announced. Results are as follows. 8 contestants eliminated due to tactical inefficiency or resource depletion. 24 advance to Phase 2. Elena checked the scoring display and was pleased to see she'd ranked in the top tier for tactical effectiveness, despite having what the system classified as the most primitive weapon in the competition. Her success was attributed to what the analysis described as optimal exploitation of technological asymmetries, combined with exceptional precision timing. Phase 2. Adaptive Problem-Solving Challenge. The arena reconfigured itself again, this time presenting what appeared to be impossible shooting problems. Targets that seemed to violate physical laws, scenarios that defied conventional tactical solutions, and challenges that required thinking beyond normal three-dimensional space. Each contestant faces a unique scenario tailored to test their ability to solve problems that cannot be addressed through conventional approaches, the director explained. Success requires understanding principles that transcend normal tactical thinking. Elena's scenario materialized around her, a target suspended in what appeared to be a temporal distortion field, moving backward through time at irregular intervals. Conventional weapons would never be able to hit it because they couldn't fire into the past, and energy weapons would be deflected by the temporal field's defensive properties. Elena studied the problem for several minutes, analyzing the temporal patterns and trying to understand the physics involved. The target wasn't actually moving through time. That was impossible. Instead, it was moving through a space-time distortion that created the appearance of temporal displacement. If she could understand the mathematics governing the distortion field, she might be able to calculate where to fire so that her bullet would encounter the target when the field brought it back into normal space-time. Elena spent precious minutes working through relativistic calculations that pushed her mathematical understanding to its limits. But eventually, she identified the pattern and fired at a point in empty space, trusting her calculations to predict where the target would materialize. The bullet hung in space for what felt like an eternity. Then the temporal field flickered, and the target appeared exactly where Elena had predicted it would be. The impact destroyed both the target and the distortion field, causing space-time to snap back to normal configuration. Extraordinary, came Director Vorthake's voice. Contestant Vasquez has solved a temporal targeting problem using purely ballistic calculations. Our review systems indicate this approach was not anticipated by the scenario designers. Elena smiled as she watched other contestants struggling with their own impossible challenges. Around the arena, beings with advanced targeting systems and quantum weapons were attempting to solve problems that couldn't be addressed through technological superiority alone. The key, Elena realized, was recognizing that these weren't really weapons problems. They were puzzle-solving exercises that required understanding fundamental principles rather than applying advanced technology. Her human military training, which emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving over technological dependence, was perfectly suited for challenges that defied conventional approaches. Phase 2 completed, the director announced after what felt like hours. 12 contestants eliminated due to inability to solve assigned scenarios. 12 advanced to final elimination round. Elena looked around at the remaining contestants and felt a mixture of pride and intimidation. She'd made it to the final 12 in a competition that had started with 500 of the galaxy's finest marksmen. But the beings around her represent